Hey everyone, welcome to Learn ReactJS for Frontend Development by CodeChef. So before we dive deeper into React, let's have a look at some of the important JavaScript features which React relies heavily on. These features are a part of JavaScript's ES6 update. So in this lesson, we'll be looking at one of the most important ES6 updates, which is let and const replacing the old var keyword. Let and const is used everywhere in React, from components to state variables, which is why understanding them will smooth your journey in React. By the end of this lesson, you'll know when to use let, when to use const, and why we no longer use the var keyword.
So let us look at the ES6 essentials, let and const. These were introduced in ES6 update of JavaScript, and as we know, they are used heavily in React code, and they are more safer and more predictable than var. So we will be looking at the third point in the further slides. First, let's look at why learn ES6 before React. React uses ES6 syntax everywhere, and it allows us to have a cleaner component code and fewer scope-related bugs. We will be looking at what is scope-related bugs. So first, let's look at what's the problem with var. Why we are using let and const over var. So var is function scoped, which means if you declare a variable using var, it can be accessed anywhere within the function and modified. So it is accessible outside blocks and can cause unexpected behavior. And scope related bugs are tough to debug and catch because the program can run normally even if it has scope related bugs. So in the code given below, you can see we have defined a variable x using var and we have assigned it a value of 10 inside the if block. And now if I try to print out that variable, it's going to print out 10. Which is unsafe. So how do we make sure that our variables are block scoped? That is, we cannot access it or modify it outside a block. This is where we use let and const. So let's look at let first. So let is block scope, which means let cannot be accessed or modified outside the block it is defined in. So a variable defined by let can be modified only if it's there in the same block as where it was defined. That is why it is ideal for changing values. So let's look at the example. First we have defined age, and now we can change age because we've used let. Now inside the if block, the variable message has the string hello. Now if I try to print it out outside of the if block, I will get an error because it is block scoped. That is, I can only access this or modify this within this block. So if I had given console.log message inside the if statement or the if block, then I wouldn't have gotten an error and I would have printed out hello. But since I'm accessing it outside the if block, I will get an error and it's not accessible over here. Now coming to const, it is similar to let, but in let you could modify the value defined by let inside the same block. But over here we cannot modify the variable at all, which means it is block scoped and it cannot be reassigned at any point. And this is the most preferred way to define variables in React because it will cause less errors. So if I define username as the string Alice, I cannot reassign it to Bob. It will give out an error because we have defined it using const. So let's look at how const works with objects. So let's say an object is defined with const. Then we can change the properties of that object, but we cannot reassign that object variable. So let's look at an example. So over here I have defined an object called user in which theme will be dark. Now I can change the theme to light. That is, I can change the property of the object, but I cannot reassign the variable of the object itself. I will get an error if I try to do that because I have defined it using const. So I can change the property of the object, but I cannot reassign the variable of that object. Similarly with arrays, if you use const with arrays, we can change the contents of the array, but then we cannot reassign the array variable itself. So let's look at an example. Let's say I have an array nums which is equal to 1, 2, 3. Now I can modify the contents, that is, I can push 4 into this array. It is allowed. But when I try to reassign this array variable entirely, it will give out an error because it's defined by const and you cannot reassign the variable. So now that we know what let, const and var is, let's look at some of the best practices to follow in React. So we should use const by default in case we do not need to modify any values, and we will use let only when we need to modify the values, and we will avoid var completely to avoid scope related bugs or any kind of errors.
So that wraps up our introduction to let and const, two of the most important features from the ES6 update, which you will be using everywhere in React. So after this lesson, don't forget to head over to the CodeChef platform and try out the practice problems yourself. That's where you'll really learn this concept. So that was it for this lesson. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.